The fourth and final requirement of the offence of gross negligence manslaughter requires that a reasonable person would have foreseen a serious and obvious risk of death in those circumstances. Now, a serious and obvious risk of death is more than just the possibility that death might have occurred. And it's definitely more than the possibility that further tests might have revealed something life-threatening. Obvious and serious risks are those which are clear and present at the time of the incident, not ones which might become apparent because of further investigation. They are ones that are really obvious to a reasonable person at that time. So let's take our question to our scenario involving Jemima and Mrs. T. Now, Mrs. T is obviously in a fragile state. She's failing to take her medication. She's failing to eat. A doctor hasn't been called, even though it was pretty obvious that she required some kind of medical attention. So, of course, there was a serious and obvious risk of death, and it would have been apparent to the reasonable person, as it should have been apparent to Jemima, Mrs. T's carer. So let's look at a few more situations where a reasonable person would have foreseen a serious and obvious risk of death. Somebody takes an overdose. The defendant has supplied the drugs to them, sees that they've had an overdose, and instead of calling for a doctor or taking them to a hospital, they just leave them. There's a reasonable person would have foreseen a serious and obvious risk of death in that situation. Or a radiologist failing to spot the early signs of cancer in an X-ray. That type of gross negligence, a reasonable person would have foreseen a serious and obvious risk of death. Or a mother failing to take her ill baby to the doctor, a serious and obvious risk of death. An electrician wiring up an electric shower wrong, a serious and obvious risks of death. So this question will be put to the jury, and they are the ones who will have to decide whether there was a serious and obvious risk of death.